Writing your own epic novel series. Do you want to be like Tolkien in writing your own Lord of the Rings series and having them being just as successful? How can it be done? Can you do it? We're going to be answering those questions and more, and we're starting right now. Everyone out there who writes books looks at the Lord of the Rings series and sees how successful they are. Even to this day, millions of people around the world read the Lord of the Rings series. Three massive books to tell one story. And every writer has that dream in the back of their mind. Can I do this? Can I write my own epic series and be just as successful? It's not easy, but it can be done. So we're going to be looking into what you as an amateur writer need to know that will help you write your own epic series and hopefully make it as successful as the Lord of the Rings series. One of the first things that you need to do is plan ahead. There are two types of writers out there, planners and pantsers. Planners like to plan every little thing in their novel, every chapter, every character. And pantsers like to just make it up as they go along. The problem with being a pantser when writing an epic 3-novel series where each book could be up to 1,000 pages is you can get lost very quickly. It's really easy to wander when writing a book without planning anything ahead. It's like walking a straight line with your eyes closed. You're convinced that you are walking a straight line. But when you finally do open your eyes, you found that you completely wandered to the left or to the right, but you were convinced that you were walking a straight line. Now imagine if you walked with your eyes opened. You would reach point A to point B because you had a point B to reach, and you got there just fine. The same thing when writing an epic series. The more you plan ahead with those 3 novels, the more likely you are to get to the end and have it successful, as opposed to having it wander all over the place to a point where you end up abandoning it. Because there are a tremendous number of writers who have attempted to write a trilogy novel only to then give up halfway through because they realistically didn't plan ahead. Because when you write 3 books, each one being like 1,000 pages, you're going to have a lot of characters, a lot of locations, and a lot of things happening. One of the best things you can do is to actually plan the ending first. The more you know of the ending, then it really helps with the beginning. Think of your characters' arcs. What are they? How do they start and where do they end up? When you plan your character's arc, it really helps write all 3 novels because you can plan it from the beginning, middle to the end. And by having the ending in mind, you have something to aim for. When you're told about writing a novel, you learn that there is a beginning, a middle, and the end. The first part about writing is the introduction. You introduce the characters and the problem. The middle is when the story picks up. This is when good things and bad things can happen to those characters. And in the end, there's the resolution, where the good guy and the bad guy finally meet, they battle, the good guy wins, and they walk away a better person because of what they have learned along the way. When you write a trilogy novel, you're actually doing this. The first novel is going to be the introduction to the problem and the main characters. The middle novel is when there's a lot of battling and a lot of bad things happen to the protagonist. You don't want things safe for your protagonist. You don't want things good for them. You want to put them through the mud. You want to make the reader fear for the protagonist. You want to make the reader convinced that the protagonist cannot win, that the odds are just too great. The villain is just too powerful. And your third novel is going to be the resolution. So basically, what you learn how to write one novel, you're applying to all 3. Your first novel will be the introduction. The second will be the story itself of the journey, and your last novel is the conclusion, when the good and bad guy finally meet each other. You're basically taking what you learned how to write one novel and you're breaking it up into three. Something you really want to do is to write down everything you can about your characters, what they look like, what the personalities, what they want, what their wants and needs are, because there's nothing worse than writing 3 books in which you forget what your main character looks like, what one of a side character looks like. And then you have to go back to your first novel and start reading from page 1 to find out what your main character looks like. Because it might take you a long time. It could take 5 to 10 years to write all 3 novels. But it's going to take somebody a couple of months to read all 3 novels. And if you describe your main character as having red hair, and the middle novel, what you wrote 5 years later, you describe them as having black hair, somebody reading, they're going to notice that. If you write your character's name is Jim, and then halfway into your 3rd novel, you're calling them Bob, well, the person reading, they're going to notice that. They're going to say, wait a second, why is all of these characters changing? When creating an epic novel, when all 3 novels, you want to write down everything you can, the location, the names. You don't want to have 2 cities that take a day to travel to. And then in your 3rd novel, it takes them an hour to get there. Well, the person reading is going to say, wait a second. In book 1, it took them a day to get there, but in part 3, it takes them an hour? How did that happen? But it took you about 7 or 8 years to get there, to that 3rd book. And you've completely forgotten that in your book 1, you mentioned it took a day to get there. And in part 3, you're saying it took an hour. Well, it's easy to forget that when there's 7 years in between you write in the 1st and 3rd book. But it might take someone a couple of weeks to read. They're going to notice that mistake. The more you write down everything, names of cities, characters' descriptions, their wants and needs, their likes and dislikes. That way, when you do write about a character traveling from point A to point B, you can look back at your notes and say, oh yes, I remember. It took a day for them in book 1. So in book 3, they have to take a day. They can't get there in an hour. The more you write down, the easier it will be for you to recall that information. Because you don't want to be writing book 3 and then literally have to pick up book 1 and start reading it from page 1 to page 1000 just to find out how long it took from point A to point B. Saying, how long did it take them? Well, now you go back and read it. Oh yes, a day. Well, it just took you a few weeks to read that. By having it written down, it goes a lot faster. This is why being a planner when writing an epic series can help you tremendously. Because if you're just making it up as you go along, it's really easy to miss those little things. The name of a city you spelt wrong. The description of a character. Maybe in book 1 a character is 6'2", and then in book 3 you say they're 5'3". Well, someone reading is going to notice that. That's why it's important to make as many notes as you can. So that way you can look at those notes, find that information, put it into your books, and make sure all the information is correct. When writing your novel, you're going to have one main storyline that's going to run through all 3 of your novels. So you have the main protagonist on a journey, just like you would if you were writing one book, but you're going to break up that journey to all 3 of your books. The next thing you want to do is have subplots with minor characters, in which those subplots will carry through all 3 books that will be solved before the main problem is solved in the final act of the 3rd book. You can also introduce minor storylines that begin and end in each book, where some storylines will not carry over to book 2, and storylines that begin in book 2 do not carry over to 3. They resolve themselves at the end of each novel. But the main storyline, that is the one that goes from the beginning all the way to the end, with a major character arc of the main character. You don't want your main character being the exact same person at the end. You want that person to go through a lot of difficulties, a lot of troubles along the way. They have to learn a lot about themselves. You want to have a villain who is truly powerful and evil. You don't want your villain to be weak or minor. The person reading it has to fear the villain. We have to identify with the protagonist. We have to see their journey. And so when the protagonist finally defeats and faces the antagonist, this is what we've been waiting for. What the protagonist learned along the way, that is what they use to defeat the villain. Make sure that every character in your story has a character arc. The more character arcs, the better. You don't want to have just one character with an arc and everybody else just pretty much being the exact same person they were from the beginning to the end. This makes the story feel weak. If you give every character in your novel some type of a character arc and a unique personality, and how they handle their problems differently than each other. You don't want all characters dealing with the problem the exact same way. You have to make each character unique unto themselves and stay true to their character. You can't have a character switching personalities when it's convenient. You have to know each character inside and out. Who are they? What do they look like? What are their wants and needs? What are they afraid of? What are their goals? What do they want out of life? The more you know of these things for each character, the more rich each character will be, making the story more believable, making the person reading want to read on. But you want to make sure each of these characters are on their own journey, their own they have to face their own problems. They have to become a different person. The more character arcs you put into your story, the more the reader is going to notice and like it and care. Don't start off your epic trilogy with a massive flashback where you're dealing with 100 pages of long, detailed explanations of who, what, where, and why. You want to start off your story with the protagonist. We want to get to know them. We want to care about them. You can have flashbacks giving us information about the past, but you want to sprinkle it throughout your novel, all 3 novels. So that way you're not just giving us this tremendous amount of information all at once, boring the reader. The faster you can introduce your protagonists and get us caring about them, the more likely we are to read the novel, and we want to see their journey, facing off against this evil villain who we truly fear, a villain who is bigger and more powerful than the protagonist. The protagonist has to worry and fear, can they win? Because if they worry, we worry. If the villain is scary, we worry about that villain. If you are planning on writing an epic trilogy, don't start one right away. Give yourself some practice at writing a smaller story first. So this way you get used to actually writing. It's like learning to play the piano. You don't want to start off by trying to play Beethoven right away. Start off with something minor. Get used to playing the piano. So that way you can work up to Beethoven. If you want to write an epic trilogy, start off with short stories, then write one novel, and then you can start writing an epic novel. So that way you have an idea of what to do and what not to do. Remember to make your characters likable. If you're going to ask someone to read 3 books that are each one 1,000 pages, we're going to want to read about someone we like, someone we identify with. If you make your characters annoying or boring, it's going to be tough to ask someone to read 3 books with those annoying, boring characters. But the more we can identify ourselves within those characters, the more we're going to want to read on, because it's us on that journey. It is us who has to face the bad guy. If you enjoyed watching this video, be sure to check out my website, where I have amazing tips on how you can become the greatest writer you can be. In fact, I'm going to leave a link to my website in the description below, where you can visit my website as fast as possible and start reading and become the greatest writer you can be. If you enjoyed watching this video on how to write an epic series, be sure to watch my next video on how you can write a story with only 6 words. That's right, 6 words to write a novel. And you know what? I'm going to leave a link for that video right here. And you can click on it and you can start watching immediately and learn how you can tell a story with only 6 words.